here at Stonebriar and been here for many years, and just glad to have you here. Glad that you can be a part of this. Just a couple of housekeeping issues as we get started. Number one, and this is important, there is no study next week. Someone at the Frisco ISD determined that they would have spring break, and everyone bows and kowtows to that. So since we're in Frisco, we don't even think about it. So just 1 week. Next week, there's no study, and then we'll get right back at the week after. It'll continue to be on Wednesdays. Even if I say it's on Saturdays, it's still Wednesdays. So don't get it all confused. So just next week will be spring break, and then we'll get right back into our study. And then we go right till the end of April. Is that right? Les, is that right? Did we go to the end of April? Did I say that right? We study till the end of April? Correct. Okay. So again, just next week off, and then we'll come right back and be back in the study. We'll give further instructions as we get close to Easter, but certainly want you to know of that. Previous lessons, they're up on the site, and they're there for you if that's something helpful to you. You can see kind of where we're going and what we're doing. And other than that, I'm ready to go if you're ready to go. So we're glad that you're here. I'll talk a little bit more about our study after we pray, but let's dedicate this time to the Lord, and we'll get started. Father, again, we come before you week by week, and we're mindful that through the ages, believers in the church, scattered through the nations, have met to study your word. Circumstances have been different, buildings and so on. Some have done this outside, some have to do it in secret. But part of being your church is immersing ourselves in your word. And so, Father, that's our prayer for this evening, that we would come to your word and that your word, as living and active, would speak in our lives through the Holy Spirit, and that you would move in us, that there would be reminders of your truth, or maybe even new things that we hadn't learned before, Father. Our prayer is that you would speak and guide us. Father, we're mindful that in a culture like ours, this may be the only time that we know for certain that we are being told the truth, and that's when we come to you. Truth hasn't been held in high regard in this society, and often when it comes to things like media, it's hard to tell what is true and what's not true and what is trying to lead us down one direction or another. But Father, we know that you speak the truth, and Father, we've also learned and been reminded that we don't always see things as they are. And so, Father, we want to be men who aren't doing what is right in our own eyes, but doing what is right in your eyes. And so we need to hear from you. And that's why we've gathered this evening, and I pray that our time together would be helpful and beneficial, that your Spirit would lead and guide, and that we might become more like Christ. For that's who you've called us to be and what you've called us to do as we grow and mature. And in becoming more like Christ, that we would be better fit to serve in your kingdom, better use to you as you call each one of us to various aspects of ministry, various people to live out our faith before. And so not only that we grow, but that we grow that we can serve, grow that we can be sure of our faith, grow that we don't waver when the culture wavers. Father, we pray this through the name of Jesus and the power of the Spirit. Amen. All right. Well, I like to ask this each week. One of the challenges that I gave you right at the very beginning is, as we work our way through various passages, as we look at various teaching, as we work in our study, I challenge you each week to try and pass that off to someone else, present it to someone else. I do that for two reasons. One is that works on your own understanding. It sharpens that, and maybe it challenges someone else or assures someone else or is a good reminder for someone else. Who this past week made an effort to talk a little bit about Samuel to someone over the last week? Good. Glad that you do that. I encourage you and I challenge you to do that each week. Today we'll talk about God's covenant that he makes with David. We'll talk about 1st and 2nd Kings, and I guarantee you someone wants to hear that. I guarantee you some of you are wondering if you could still sneak out at this point now that we said 1st and 2nd Kings. I promise you it'll be good. Or we'll have free stuff if it's not, something like that. we'll figure out a way. But that's always one thing. And the other thing I would say is what we're really trying to do in this study is to ask the question, what do believers believe? That is, in the New Testament, it's believers that is the primary name or description that we get. Today we would use the word Christian, and that's perfectly fine. It's used in the New Testament 3 times. But the majority, I think 42 times in the book of Acts, we're called believers. That is, we are Christians because of very specific beliefs. And so we're simply asking, well, what are they, or how do we get to them? And we've talked a little bit about things like councils and creeds that the early church used to sort of standardize, and church doctrinal statements, and those are all good things. But what we're really doing is we're just working our way through the biblical text, which, interestingly enough, much of it is story. And so we're kind of following the story that God is telling as he's telling us what's going on. And in that, we are finding and covering and crossing the major development of Christian doctrine. That is, we're literally doing theology or doing doctrinal studies by just reading Scripture and working towards understanding. And if you remember, I've told you that primarily the teaching of the Bible, if you wanted to sort of summarize it by topic, really comes down to 6 major things. There are some other things that the Bible covers, but the 6 major things is the Bible teaches us about God. It's God's word about himself. And there's lots of ways we could break that out into studying the Trinity and the Father and the Son and the Spirit, and then specifically studying the Son, studying Christology and studying him as Messiah. There's lots of ways to break it out. But fundamentally, the Bible teaches us about God. It teaches us about ourselves, mankind or humanity. It teaches us about sin. It teaches us about salvation. And it ultimately teaches us about the church, really a New Testament phenomenon, and ultimately about the end. So God, man, sin, salvation, the church, and the end. And what you're seeing, if you've been through our studies as we're working, is that other than the church, which, as I've said, comes in the New Testament, we're seeing aspects of those through all these passages, although primarily what we're seeing is a lot about God and a lot about ourselves as sinful, primarily, is the role that we play, a lot about sin, and then even about salvation. And so we are simply trying to understand the beliefs by working through the story of Scripture. And so that's really our question: what do believers believe? I want to talk about what we covered last week, just sort of by way of review, and it kind of gets us going. We were working in the book of Samuel, and we were talking about this unique character in the Bible, Samuel. Samuel is, in one sense, the last judge. He's at the end of the time period of the judges, and yet in another way, he's really a prophet. A prophet speaks for God, and so Samuel has this unique role of leading Israel. He's not a king, but he ends up then to anoint the first king of Israel, and that would be King Saul. So he's kind of this bridge that goes from the judges to the kings, Saul, then David, and later Solomon, and so on. He's this bridge, this bridge, and he really represents God, and he leads God's people well. Samuel is a good model of a leader, and so we picked up the story our last time together in 1 Samuel 8, where Samuel's growing old, and he doesn't have a plan for what happens next. And so he kind of, I guess my sons can lead. And immediately the other leaders in Israel said, no, your sons take bribes. Your sons don't walk in your way. And of course, I remind you of that because this was a problem in the book of Judges, that each successive generation chose not to follow the Lord. And I don't have to say it, but those are challenges that face the church today, when statistics are astronomical about those born and raised in the church, and when they get of a certain age, many of them don't come back. And so this is something that we see, and it happened in Samuel's life. And so the people say, we want a king, and that really offends, if you remember the story, it offends Samuel, because Samuel recognizes that they have a king. God is their king, and God recognizes that, and so on. And so that's where we had the story. We looked at 1 Samuel 8. We looked at 1 Samuel 12, which is really Samuel reviewing some of the history of what God has done for his people. And so I just want to kind of remind you about the kinds of things that we're learning. That is, what are the passages that we looked at last time teaching us about God? I tried to come up with an analogy. I don't quite like this one, but I'm going to use it. Imagine if you had kids, if you have kids, depending on their ages and so on. If they're older, imagine back to when they're early teenagers. If they're not old enough yet, then you got to imagine forward. It doesn't matter. But kind of 13, 14 years old, your kids come to you and your wife, let's say, if that's the situation, and they say, Mom, Dad, we love you and all that, but we'd like different parents. So we're going to be moving, and we're going to be living with Billy because his mom and dad, they let him do this, that, and the other thing. And so again, don't be offended, but we're leaving, right? That's kind of what God's people are doing to God. Yes, you're the King of Kings, right? That's good. We just want a real king, right? A real king is someone who, if you remember the passage, he's going to take our sons and our daughters, he's going to use our sons in the military and our daughters in service to him, and he's going to take our best cattle and take our land and all these things that he's going to take in demand of us. That's what we're looking for. And so it's God's people openly and willingly, if you will, leaving God. And I would just want you to know straight up, I would be really, really angry. And if I was God, I wouldn't even, there'd be no verses, there'd be no prophet, just God's people were no more. That's what I would do. But God is gracious. And so I want you to see, as we read these stories, we see the character of God coming out, that in God's grace, he doesn't just smote them. He warns them of some of the pitfalls of having a human king, and we talked about those last time, but God acts in grace and compassion. And so we see some of these things here. Let me read just one passage from last week, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7 and 8. Then the Lord told them, speaking to Samuel, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It's not you they have rejected. They've rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. God knows exactly what's going on. It's not only that they rejected God as their king in 1 Samuel 8. God's like, they've actually been doing it ever since I brought them out of Egypt. They've habitually been doing it, serving other gods, doing their own thing. And so Samuel is upset because Samuel's a godly man and is concerned, and yet God is quick to point out, no, don't. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Another thing we see about God, and just kind of a reminder, and this kind of gets us to where we want to go, is that if you remember, if you were here last time together, we went back to Deuteronomy 17, which is where God said, when you get into the land and you've settled in the land, then at some point you're going to ask for a king, and here's the requirements. And if you remember, it was things like that the king was not to be an acquirer of many horses, right? And a king was not to accumulate silver and gold. And a king was not to accumulate many wives. And the king, if you remember in Deuteronomy 17, his first act of power was to go to the scribes, get a copy of the scrolls, and make his own copy. If you remember that, he had to literally write it out by hand that he would be a follower of the Lord's law all the days of his life. So all that's outlined in Deuteronomy 17, and then many years later, in 1 Samuel 8, it happens. And so rest assured, over and over in Scripture, God shows us that he knows precisely what's going to happen. We're going to see that again today as we continue our study. But we see that God is gracious, and we see that it's so clear to God what will happen in the future, even though we don't know that. And we see God giving wise counsel to the people. In this case, when they ask for a king, he warns them, don't forget, here's what's going to happen. And so when we get to what has these passages taught us about people, I think the first thing is we see people, let's blame them first, make really bad decisions, even when they're warned. And maybe we do too. That is, the people don't care about the warnings. They want a king because they have in their mind that the Babylonians have a king, and the Assyrians have a king, and the Philistines, they have a king, and everyone gets a king, and so we want a king like that. And they don't care about the consequences. Now, they will shortly. They'll start to care about the consequences already in the life of Saul. But they were warned and they don't listen, and I think that's I think that's for all of us, that God warns us, don't do this. This wasn't my plan. This wasn't my purpose. And sometimes we do that. And that's what we see people doing back in 1 Samuel 8 and beyond. It teaches us about ourselves. I think we can say, when we say, well, what does this teach us about sin? We sin easily, or at least they did. I mean, they're quick to sin. They're quick to disobey. They're quick to fall away from the Lord in light of the Lord's blessing. I think we can see that as we're quick to forget what God has done, especially if we find ourselves in a new predicament. In the new predicament, we forget how God delivered us from the old predicament, because the new predicament is all-consuming, and often we don't trust him. We don't follow him. I just grab again one verse here to remind us about sin. 1 Samuel 12:19, I'm reading. The people all said to Samuel, "Pray to the Lord our God that your servants, so that we don't die, for we had added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king." God warned them. He said, it's harvest time, and you've got this big, beautiful harvest that's ready to be gathered and harvested, the wheat harvest and so on. And so just to kind of show you that I'm God, I'll be sending rain now, okay, when you don't want rain. And so he literally sends rain right in front of them to wipe out their entire crops, right? A year of crops have now been wiped out, just to remind them, I'm still your king. Like, even when you reject me as your king, I'm still your king. I'm the one who sends rain or withholds rain. And so they recognize God's kingliness, for lack of better words, and they say, "Pray to the Lord your God for your servants, that we will not die. For we have added to all our other sins," of which we can go back to Judges and so on and see all of those, "all our other sins with the evil of asking for a king." In other words, they recognized what they were doing was wrong. And again, we see that the Lord doesn't kill them, that even in wiping out their crops, he ends up providing for them. And so God is quick to save. That is, that there is judgment, but then there is salvation. God is quick to save. So I want to pick up the story now that we have Samuel has asked for a king. Let's take a peek at the king, see how that goes, and we'll just kind of keep following our story. Again, we're trying to see, what is the Bible wanting to teach us about God and about ourselves and about sin and about salvation, and in this case, maybe a little bit about the end. We'll see if that comes up. 1 Samuel 15. 1 Samuel 15. So we're looking at the life of Saul. Saul was chosen as the first king of Israel. I also want to remind you just real briefly that 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is really one book. It's the book of Samuel. And it gets split into 1 and 2. It was originally written on scrolls. And if you've ever seen how sort of the scroll system works, you would have a roll on either side, and you would roll it open and close. And they would write in columns on a scroll. And so 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is such a long work, or Samuel was such a long work, that they just cut the scroll in half. And so it's kind of Samuel scroll 1 and Samuel scroll 2. It's a continuous story. And so sort of by tradition, our English Bibles continue to bear that out. Just know that 1 Samuel leads into 2 Samuel. It's just one long book. Same story for Kings, 1 and 2 Kings. Same story for Chronicles, 1 and 2 Chronicles. Those are each one long book where they divided the scroll in two. So we're in 1 Samuel chapter 15. I'm not, hopefully you are. But we are looking at the life of Saul, this first king of Israel. And so I want to pick it up in verse 2. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 2. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now, go and attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belong to them. Don't spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So I don't know if you know the story, you remember the story. Back in the book of Exodus, we didn't cover it, but back in the book of Exodus, as they're coming out of the land, immediately they're opposed by the Amalekites. And it's recorded in Exodus 17 if you're looking for the story. But I want to highlight one verse, one passage from that story to kind of remind you why it comes up now. Because what God is saying is now it's time to put the Amalekite people to an end. They've had time to repent, literally hundreds of years. They have not. And so it's time to put them to an end. If we go back to the story, this is how the story ended in Exodus 17, verse 16. God said, because hands were lifted. Oh, and I should just remind you, because you'll probably remember the story this way. There's a battle between the Israelites and the Amalekites in Exodus 17. And as long as Moses holds his hands up, and he's got a staff in his hand and it's outstretched, then the Israelites are winning. And if his hands go down, then the Amalekites win. So you remember they get him a stone to sit on, and then you got, I think it was Joshua on one side, another one on the other side, and they're holding up his arms, and ultimately Israel wins. Right? And so it's done with Israel, with Moses' hands being held out towards the battlefield. And so this is now, after that has happened, God said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war with the Amalekites from generation to generation. That is, the Amalekites wanted to get the Lord's people, and so it's a play on these hands because Moses lifted up his hands so that the Israelites would win. And so now it's because hands were lifted up against the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. This is going to be an ongoing thorn in the flesh. Okay, so in 1 Samuel 15, God says, Saul, enough. Let's deal with the Amalekites. Every last one of them. You got to wipe them. These are people whose hands are turned against the Lord or whose faces are turned against the Lord. It's time to wipe them out. Pick up the story in verse 8. So Saul begins this process. Verse 8, he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and all the people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the armies spared Agag, the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and the lambs. Everything that was good, these they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. Okay? So Saul did his job. Right? He was told to destroy everything. He destroyed everything. Smart guy, meaning let's save the best stuff, right? And you know why you'd want to save the best cattle and the lambs and so on. That would be to sacrifice to the Lord, right? I mean, that's obviously that's how that would be used. And so we continue on, verse 10. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all the night. Right? Saul reinterpreted the command, and that's what I did as a kid. You know, my parents would say, you can do this, you can't do that, and I'd reinterpret it, and then I'd always say that I obeyed, right? And in my disobedience, I just tried to describe my disobedience as an act of obedience, which is exactly what Saul does here. Samuel's going to confront him, and Saul's going to say, I obeyed. I obeyed. It's interesting that we see sort of what happens here when Saul disobeys. We see it towards the end of the chapter here. Samuel is going to confront Saul, and we're going to pick that up here in verse 20. 1 Samuel 15, verse 20. Saul is saying, but I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king, and the soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. See, it was for sacrifice. But Samuel replied, and this is telling, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, which is what disobedience is, right? God says, Saul said, right? So Saul said something different. He rejects God's word. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, He has rejected you as king. It's an interesting point. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices? Sometimes, if you read the Old Testament selectively, you see a lot of sacrifices and a lot of animals and priests and altars and ceremony. We talked a few weeks back about Leviticus 16, where they have the yearly sacrifice, the Day of Atonement, as it's known. And you might think, boy, all God ever wants is these dead animals and these burnt offerings. And it's like, no, he allows for that to cover up your sin. What he actually wants you to do is obey so you don't have to sacrifice anything. And so obeying was not really what Saul was interested in. He was just, hey, I accumulated all these animals for you. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and arrogance the evil of idolatry. And because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And God pulls Saul as king of Israel. Samuel, in just a chapter, is going to anoint another king, another family. It should go to Jonathan, right? That would be Saul's son, would be Jonathan, but it's not going to go to Jonathan. It's going to go to a different family. Ultimately, it's going to go to this new shepherd boy, David, from a different tribe. Saul was a Benjamite, and David is going to be, or David is, from the tribe of Judah. I want to show a little bit here as to what happens. We're reading in 1 Samuel. We're at the very beginning of the kingdom. And so I want to go back here a little bit and see if I can show you a little bit of where I want to go. I'm just going to pull this here. Hopefully you'll be able to see this on the screen. Yeah, good. So all I want you to see here, and you should be able to see it just from where you're sitting, all I want you to appreciate is that red area on the map is the area that Saul governs when he's king. Saul's kingdom is that red area there. That's sort of what the nation of Israel looks like. We're going to get to David, and I want to just show you, rather than even telling you, I just want to show you, we're going to go from Saul's kingdom to David's kingdom, and I just want you to see if you can figure out why David becomes more popular than Saul. So here's Saul's kingdom is in the red, and then we get over here, and David's kingdom is in the blue. You see what the next king of Israel is going to do? You see how much he pushes back the borders? Okay? So got to think about it the right way. Borders are enemies against Israel. So when Saul is king, when he becomes king, it's that red, maybe pinkish color that you can see. And then when David becomes king, David's this great and mighty warrior. He is the one who attacks the enemies and pushes them back. And can you see that under King David, it's way, way, way bigger? Can you see how big the kingdom becomes? And so this is part of the story of Israel, and part of, as we're going to get to David here in just a moment, I just wanted you to be able to see this. I now want to jump in time, and I want to kind of show you how much time I'm going to jump. And so this kind of, at the bottom here, let's go like this. This area right here, you can kind of see that that's in yellow. This is going to represent the time of the kingdom where the kingdom is whole. That is, this is going to be the reigns of Saul, and then of David, and then of Solomon. Because after Solomon, the kingdom's going to divide, okay? And so I just want to show you that yellow color is the unified kingdom, and then we're going to get to kind of a light blue color, and it's going to be the divided kingdom. And I just want you to be able to see the difference. So here comes the yellow kingdom. That's the united kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon. And then it divides, and we have the north and the south. We have Israel and Judah. And ultimately, we're going to get Assyria to come in here, and they're going to take the north. And then this red color in the timeline there, that's the 70-year exile. That represents when Judah goes into Babylon for 70 years. That's a 70-year time frame. And then we get to this green color, and this green color is going to be when the Persian Empire arises. And all of that, because I'm trying to get you right here. That's Esther. That's the time when Esther becomes queen in Susa, and Susa is the capital city, or at least one of the capital cities of the Persian Empire. Okay, so I just went, and I just wanted to kind of help you think this through, because I want to talk about Esther here. And so I just want you to appreciate that we went from Saul to David to Solomon to the divided kingdom, and we went all these years, and then the 10 tribes in the north, they're lost into Assyria, and then the 2 tribes in the south, they go into exile, and they're in Babylon for 70 years, and then they come back, and the Persian Empire is in control, and then into the Persian Empire, we hit Esther. So we went essentially to the very end chronologically of our Old Testaments, okay? All I really want you to see is we moved a lot, okay? We moved an awful lot. We moved into the book of Esther, okay? So we talked about Saul. Saul was commanded, kill the Amalekites. And Saul said, I did. But he didn't, right? I mean, he killed most of them, but he left the king, and he left the best cattle and so on. And so now we get to the book of Esther. And if you kind of remember the story of Esther, Esther comes to power because essentially she wins a beauty contest, right? She becomes the king of Persia because she's the one the king selects after he had rejected his original wife. And so comes to power. And then there's this antagonist. There's someone who's against the Jews. And I just want you to meet him in Esther chapter 3, verse 1. After these events, King Xerxes, that's the king of Persia that Esther is married to, honored Haman, the son of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and putting him in the seat of honor higher than all the other nobles. Haman, the one who's going to hate Mordecai, Haman, the one who's going to hate the Jews and have this grand plan to kill all the Jews across the Persian Empire, that Haman, he's an Agagite. An Agagite? What on earth is an Agagite? Oh, I wonder if that's a descendant of Agag, the king that Saul didn't kill. Do you see? There's a whole bunch of interesting things going on. Esther, years and years and years and years and years and years and years later, has to clean up Saul's work. God uses Esther to fix the problem that Saul caused back in 1 Samuel 15. That is, he didn't kill everyone, he left the king and presumably the king's kids, because by the end of 15, Samuel kills King Agag himself. But they weren't thorough, and as a result, Agag has some descendants, and those descendants have descendants, and those descendants have descendants, and as it turns out, the Amalekites still hate the Israelites, and one of their descendants, named Haman, ends up in Susa, and now has a plan, because he has the ear of Xerxes, that let's get rid of the Jews once and for all. And if you know the story of Esther, it's Mordecai and then Esther who comes and is challenged with this dilemma that she's really not allowed to go to the king on her own. The king really has to call for her, and it could cost her her life. And then Mordecai says, yeah, but our people are going to die. Maybe you were made for such a time as this. Remember, there is no such a time as this if Saul does his job. And so it's interesting that God doesn't forget. He still works. The job does get finished. It gets finished, if you know the story. Haman ends up getting hung on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai to get hung on, and ultimately Mordecai is going to get his job, and the Jews will be saved, and there'll be new decrees that are issued, and so on and so forth. But the whole story that happens way later, at the very end of the Old Testament, chronologically, never should have happened. There never should have been a Haman. It's interesting. Remember what I read in Exodus 17:16? That the Amalekites will continue to push against God's people for generation after generation after generation. It goes from Exodus all the way to Esther, which chronologically is virtually your whole Old Testament. Exodus to Esther. So Saul's little, well, I really kept God's word, when he didn't keep God's word, there are consequences, and we see that through the book of Esther. Back to Saul. Saul proves to be faithless. We've already read that God will take the kingdom from him and is going to give it to David. And so now I've showed you that David expands his kingdom and greatly pushes back the enemies. He's a warrior and he's a hard after God. And so he starts to settle down as he's pushed the boundaries way north and south and all the way to the Mediterranean Sea and the west and into even across the Jordan on the east side. And so he starts to settle down. He's built himself a nice place in Jerusalem. By the way, David is the one who conquers Jerusalem to make it a capital city. Before David, the Israelites don't control Jerusalem. Jerusalem belongs to the Jebusites, and so David conquers it and then makes it God's city. And then he gets this great idea. You know, he's built himself a house and things are looking good and so on. He goes, you know what? God still lives in a tent, right? God had that tabernacle, and he says, I should build a house for God. So he approaches Nathan. If you remember, Nathan is the prophet who will later confront David. He approaches Nathan and says, I would like to build a house for God. And Nathan goes, okay, that sounds good. Go ahead. And then God speaks to Nathan that night and says, I want you to tell David this. Turn to 2 Samuel chapter 7, and we want to see what happens in this particular situation. What is Nathan supposed to tell David about building God a house? 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning in verse 8. 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning in verse 8. Now then, God says to Nathan, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. Let's just stop there for a moment. I will make your name great. Well, probably that reminds you of a few things. Let's go back. You remember with Abraham, God made this promise to Abraham. We've talked about it, this covenant in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. And in there, God says to Abraham, I will make your name great. And it's interesting that all these years later, we still know who Abraham is. And now God says the same thing to David, I will make your name great. And we still know the name David, and still a name that's used to this day. Abraham is a name used to this day amongst many cultures. David is a name that's used to this day. God does do what he says he will do. Let's go back further. Remember the Tower of Babel? That's Genesis 11. That's just before God gives this covenant to Abraham. Remember in Genesis 11, the question is, why are you building the tower? Well, we want to make a name for ourselves. So the issue at hand is who gets to make whose name great? David says, I'm going to build the Lord a house. Here in Jerusalem, we've got peace. I'm going to build him a temple. I'm going to build him a house. And God says, I will make your name great. That is, you're not in the business of making my name great. You can't. But I can do something for you. I'll make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. This is what David accomplishes. By pushing the enemies back, by expanding the kingdom, Israel now lives at peace. You in your olive groves and your orchards and someone else, you with your vineyards and so on, all of a sudden you can farm in peace because your enemies are miles away, are far away because David has expanded the kingdom and it's become safe and it's become stable. And this is what God is saying. I'm going to let you plant a place so that they will have they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did in the beginning. Well, that was the Amalekites. That was the Philistines. Remember, David has a run-in with Goliath and pushes the Philistines back. Later, as king pushes them back, Saul never did that. As they did in the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from your enemies, peaceful land. The Lord declares to you, and the Lord himself will establish a house for you. Oh, there's a little turn of events. David has this idea, I'm going to build God a temple. And God says, no, I'm going to build you a house. Okay, a little play on words here. They're having some fun with explaining this. So David won't be building God a house. God will be building David a house. That's interesting. No one saw that coming. I'll build a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood. Well, we'll know later that's going to be ultimately Solomon, right? Solomon will become the next king of Israel, and that's going to be David's second born with his wife Bathsheba. Remember, they have a child, a baby boy, out of the adultery, and that baby boy is taken by the Lord. And of course, David has Uriah killed and then marries Bathsheba, and then they have another son. And so their second son, or the first one that lived, past infanthood, is Solomon, and he's going to be the next king. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom, and he is the one who will build a house for my name. So I'll let your son, Solomon, build a house for my name, and of course you probably know Solomon does. He builds the temple. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Oh, that sounds long. That sounds big. You need to appreciate there's a problem in history that probably David is now thinking about this differently than what actually happens. You can pick any era of history anywhere on the planet. You can go Chinese history. You can go modern European history. You can pick some tribe in South America and follow their history. Essentially, we have no record in history of ever having more than 7 successful generations producing a male heir. There's always someone who can't have a kid or can only have girls if boys are required in the particular lineage. That is, all lineages eventually break down. No one ends up with a perpetual son after son after son after son after son. There's always a problem. There's always someone dies, someone gets sick, someone is murdered, and then the uncle takes over, or whatever the story. You never can get past 7. Look at any history at any time period. You'll never see more than 7 in a row. And so if that's what David's thinking, that would already be miraculous. That David's son would have a son, and that son would have a son, and that son would have a son, and so on, grandson, great-grandson, great-great, on forever. That would be absolutely miraculous if that's what God meant, right? Because that doesn't happen. That just does. Look at English history. King Henry VIII is the perfect illustration. He doesn't have a son, which clearly is his wife's fault. So he runs through as many wives as he can, trying desperately to have a son. It still doesn't work out for him. After all the catastrophe he creates, he still doesn't have a proper heir, even at the end of his life. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I think that's probably what David thought. That forever there will be a descendant of David on the throne. And just having that many descendants is amazing. That would be an amazing miracle that's never happened in history. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with flogging inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever. Before me, your throne will be established forever. That's the message Nathan gets to give to David. David says, I'm going to build God a house. God ultimately tells David, no, I'm going to build David a house. Okay, and we're playing on the word house here because the house is this eternal kingdom, which is really interesting because David does have a son, and it's Solomon. He has multiple sons. If you know the story of David's sons, I mean, you've already had one son kill another. You've had one son rape one of the daughters, and so on. There's been lots of death in David's family, and it's an awful situation. But Solomon becomes king, and then later it's going to be Solomon's son Rehoboam who will become king. And then after Rehoboam, there will be a succession of kings and so on, and it looks like maybe that's what it means, which is going to become really troubling when I start to show you where we don't have any kings. right? Because when they come back from exile, there is no king. Cyrus is king. As a matter of fact, Cyrus is the one, he's the king of Persia, and he's the one who says you can go back, everyone gets to go back, rebuild your capital cities, rebuild your temples, worship your gods, put up walled cities, do whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, no one gets a king. So Israel doesn't have a king. And all through the intertestamental period, the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, those 400 years, Israel doesn't have a king. The time when Alexander the Great comes and the Greeks and so on, and then we get to the Romans, and then when Jesus is born, Israel doesn't have a king. Although someone kind of likes the title, and so if you remember, there's an Idumean who's ruling on behalf of the Romans named Herod, and he takes for himself a title. I'm King of the Jews. Which is interesting because in the Romans' eyes, an Idumean, that's close enough to a Jew, he must be a Jew. But to a Jew, Herod was not a Jew. Herod was a descendant of Esau, not of Jacob. And so Herod has taken this title, King of the Jews. He's really the next king to reign after the exile, but he's not a line of David. He has nothing to do with David. He's from Esau, not from Jacob. And then wise men come from the east. I wonder where they're from. I don't know, maybe Persia? And they come to the king of the Jews and they say, where is he who's born King of the Jews? And Herod's like, I'm right here. No, not you, the king of the Jews. Right? And so Jesus is ultimately going to fulfill this prophecy in a way that no one's anticipating. That is, it isn't all about successive generations. It's about one eternal king. I highly doubt David could ever imagine that. Not back in those days. Maybe he could. I don't know. But there would be no sign of that from the biblical text that Jesus is going to fulfill this in a way that no one's anticipating. So, this is the covenant that God makes with David. We come to know this. A covenant is an agreement. We come to know this as the Davidic covenant, the covenant God makes with David. So let's just be mindful of what we've covered so far. So very briefly, God makes a covenant with Noah that I'll never send rain again. The sign of the covenant is the rainbow, okay? It's good and it's important. It doesn't really connect to the other ones. The other ones sort of fit together. Then God makes a covenant with Abraham, which ultimately culminates in land, seed, and blessing. I'm going to give you land, you and your offspring, of which he has none. I'm going to give you offspring, that you ultimately will have descendants as many as the sand in the sea, on the seashore, the stars in the sky, of which he has none at that point. And then I'm also going to give you, I'm going to bless you, and ultimately through you, Abraham, all the nations of the world will be blessed, although that's not explained. So that's the Abrahamic covenant. And then you'll remember, if you've been to these studies, that over and over and over God acts because he says, well, I promised this to Abraham, and then I renewed it with Isaac and Jacob. And so this Abrahamic covenant comes up over and over and over, and even though when God's people are wicked, God says, yes, but I already made a promise, and I'm one who keeps my promises. I promised Abraham, and so he obeys. The next covenant is God makes with Moses, and it's kind of a unique one. It's not a covenant for people or land or blessing or not sending rain. It's a covenant of rules, of law that says, here's what you can do, and if you do these things, you will be blessed, obeying God, living for God. And if you do these things, if you disobey, you will be cursed. It gives you options. You can choose either one. You're free to choose. If you go this route, these are the blessings. If you go this route, these are the curses. It's the Mosaic covenant. The law is a covenant of blessings and curses. And you can pick what you like, right? If you're big on getting cursed, you follow the law and you receive the curses accordingly, as God has said. And now we get this next covenant, and this is a really important one, that in the middle of David wanting to build God a house or a temple, God says, no, I'm going to build you a house, and it's going to last forever. And so often we're going to see a coming together of the covenant with Abraham and the covenant of David. They're going to become very, very important from this point on, 2 Samuel 7, all the way to the end of the Old Testament and all the way into the New Testament. The Abrahamic covenant and the Davidic covenant will be the two important covenants that sort of get carried on through, and we'll see that as we go forward. And so that kind of gives us a sense of the book of Samuel. It begins with Samuel, it gets to the anointing of the first king. That is, Saul becomes the first king. It gets to the downfall of Saul's empire. It gets to the anointing of the second king, that's David. It gets through much of the life of David and the kingship of David. It includes in 2 Samuel 7 this covenant that God makes with David, this eternal promise that your kingdom will last forever. And it really ends at the end of David's reign. 2 Samuel ends at the end of David's reign, and then we get to 1st and 2nd Kings. So it's important as we kind of think about these things. Again, we have God making promises, and there's no reason for him to make any promises. He doesn't owe David anything. He doesn't, well, I really should do this. He doesn't need to do that. He doesn't have to do that. But he chooses to do that, and then he holds himself to a promise. And so, again, I remind you, we've got to think about the way God presents himself. He is willing to make promises to us that he doesn't owe us. And then even in our disobedience, he obeys and keeps his promises. We saw that with the Abrahamic covenant, even though God's people didn't always obey or deserve those blessings. And now we're going to see it with the Davidic covenant and sort of what happens next. I want to go back to our little map and timeline and kind of tell you a little bit about what's about to happen here. We have the United Kingdom here. So at the end of the book of Samuel, we have Saul's kingdom and David's kingdom. I'm just going to back up just a little bit here, and I'm just going to show you Solomon's kingdom, how this works, so that you can see the whole thing. All right, so what you're looking at, you see kind of the red or pink, and that's Saul's kingdom, and then overlaid on top of that is David's kingdom, and then we're going to get on top of that, I'm going to move this, and we're going to get Solomon's kingdom. And what you can see is in the north, you see that he adds just a little bit more here. So you see that they grow to the north a little bit. This is interesting because, David's foreign policy is, I'm simply a warrior who's going to defeat you in your army. And that's how he expands the kingdom. But Solomon has a different foreign policy. He's not a warrior. He's like, I'm going to marry your daughter, and you're going to come for Thanksgiving, and we're going to work it out. And so literally he conquers these lands by marriage, not by war. But he marries in and takes control of these lands by marrying king's daughters and tribal daughters. And anyone, you get anyone forward, and I'm sure Solomon's willing to marry them. And so he expands the kingdom just a little bit more. Basically the same size as David, and then just a little bit on the top is what Solomon does. And if you know the story, after Solomon taxes the people tremendously. When David dies, he takes his entire fortune and he bequeaths it to Solomon, not for Solomon, but for building the temple. David tells his son, when you build the temple, use my fortune. I've got gold, I've got silver, I've got precious jewels, I've got all these things that I've accumulated. Use that. Then Solomon, through his life, as he's accumulating wealth, uses his own wealth to build the temple as well. So he's got David's wealth and his own wealth, and then he taxes the people very heavily to get their wealth. And then we get little spots in the building of the temple where we find out that other countries are literally bringing some of their wealth to Solomon. He's so well known throughout the earth that others are bringing some of their gold and silver to the project so that that will be used in the temple. So needless to say, that first temple, the temple that Solomon built, was the most amazing building ever to be on earth up to that point. Okay? We are talking gold and jewels and silver of untold wealth. Now, it wasn't that it was that massive, but it was that ornate. It was unbelievable, all of David's wealth and Solomon's wealth, and then the heavy taxation of the people and all the work that they did to build that temple for God. And then if you know the story, eventually Solomon, of course, gets distracted with his wives and ends up worshiping their gods and building temples for their gods. And so the fact that he built such a beautiful temple for God becomes sort of a shadow of all the other temples he built for all the other gods. And Solomon did some strange things. He married the daughter of Pharaoh in Egypt. If you remember, the whole Egypt story was God delivers his people from Egypt. He gets them out of Egypt and to their own land, and Solomon marries back in. Like, I'm going to marry back in towards slavery, which isn't that far off from what sort of happens. And so Solomon ends up building temples for his wives so that they can worship the gods from their home countries, and in that process, eventually will begin to worship there himself. And you know what God says? He says to Solomon, I should take the kingdom from you, but I made a promise to your dad. Right? The Davidic covenant is what's going to stop God from removing the kingship from Solomon and maybe grabbing another family and another person to start over again. That never happens because God says, I made a promise to your dad. Your dad was faithful, although his life ended poorly as well. That is, David's life ended poorly with the sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, and then his whole family was an absolute train wreck. And so, but even in that, God keeps his promises. He keeps his promises, and so from Solomon, the kingdom goes to Rehoboam. And if you know the story of Rehoboam, it's a fascinating story. He's a young man, probably around 20 or so. And so when he comes to power, he goes to his dad's advisors, to Solomon's advisors, and he says, what do you think I should do as king? And they say, lower the taxes. It's too big a burden for the people to bear. We've built the temple, lower the taxes. He says, thank you. And then he goes to his buddies, all his buddies, the guys that he hangs with, right? The guys who he goes to In-N-Out Burgers with the souped-up cars. He goes to them and he says, what do you guys think we should do? I'm king now. What do you think we should do? Jack up the taxes. This is your time to make money. Double down. Do twice as much as your dad did. And so now you have a decision. He's gotten good advice. He's gotten foolish advice. Good advice and foolish advice. And what's he going to do? And of course, if you know the story, he doubles down on the taxes and the kingdom breaks. There is no way on God's green earth, the northern folks say, that we're sending all that money down to the south. We don't even live near Jerusalem. Well, why would we send all that money? And so the country breaks, and typical of how a country breaks is just like how a church splits when there's a split. You don't end up, when a church of 1,000 people splits, you don't end up with two churches of 500. If you did, that maybe that's not even too bad, but that's not what happens, right? You end up with a church of 150 and another church of 12, and everyone else becomes disillusioned. That's exactly what happens to Israel. This is a little harder to see. I'll do my best to show you here. I want you to see if you can make a sense of how big the kingdom is once it divides under Rehoboam, because that's what comes, that's what comes next here. So I'm going to move. I'm going to get rid of I don't know if you can see this, but kind of green in the north. I'll just outline it for you here. So here's the kingdom of Israel, and here's the kingdom of Judah. Two separate countries now, smaller than when Saul reigned. So once the country breaks into two, it's not like it's two and strong, it's two and pathetic. That's really what it is, it's two and pathetic. And so Jeroboam is one of Solomon's advisors, and so Jeroboam will become the king of the north, and Rehoboam, that's Solomon's son, is the king of the south. He's of the Davidic line. He's ruling in Jerusalem. And so now you have a divided kingdom, north and south, Israel and Judah, and from that point on, it's fractured, and it's small, and it's not strong, and things begin to fall apart. I'm trying to introduce the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. Again, 1st and 2nd Kings is really one book. The story happens, and then later 1st and 2nd Kings is written, so I want you to kind of follow through. In the north, what they immediately realize is that we can't let our people worship God down in Jerusalem because Jerusalem's in the south. We need our own places of worship. But God says, where I put my name, that's the only place you can worship. And so now they realize if we're going to worship God, we can only be in Jerusalem. So then Jeroboam concludes, I guess we don't worship God. So they set up high places to worship. Dan and Bethel is where he'll end up building the places of worship, one in the north side, one in the south side, so that the people in the north don't have to cross boundaries into the south to worship God. They'll worship their own, ultimately Baal and Asherah and other local deities that they'll end up worshiping. And so the north goes through a succession of 20 kings, every one of them wicked and evil. They are worshiping other gods, built right into their warp and woof. God is faithful. He sends prophets and so on. And ultimately in 722 BC, that's 722 years before the birth of Christ, more or less, Assyria comes, and it just looks like this. Let me just show you what happens here. It's just a little easier to see it. So if we go... there's our divided kingdom. There. So there's Assyria, that's in blue, and it just comes and it ends up swallowing up the north, the 10 tribes in the north. And that happens in 722 BC. So Israel, which is made up of 12 tribes, is really Israel made up of 2 tribes, right? They lose 10. Now, it's a little more complicated than that because during the time of the kings, those who are faithful realize we can't keep living up here in the north. So you have leaks. People from all the 10 tribes end up moving down. Some, a few, not big numbers, but some end up moving down to Judah. And so really all 12 tribes, or representation from all 12 tribes, are living in the south when the north is lost. But the south isn't that much more faithful either. Most of their kings are faithless. A few are faithful. And so it isn't that many years later, in 586 BC, that Babylon comes for the 3rd time, and they destroy Jerusalem, and the temple, and the walls, and they take people captive, and they bring them over to Babylon, and they'll be there for 70 years. Okay? So the beginning of the kingdom is the beginning of the end. Saul's a great king, except that he's not. David's a man after God's own heart, except that ultimately he becomes a man after his own heart and ends up to live a very wicked and immoral life towards the end of his life. Solomon starts off as the wisest person ever known, but gets distracted through his many wives, all of which are forbidden, back in Deuteronomy chapter 17. To introduce 1st and 2nd Kings, we have to understand a little bit about how these books are being written and then why they're being written. And so I'm going to go here to show you this. These are the Bible scrolls here. I know you can't see the details, but the Bible is arranged thematically. And so the first 5 books on the left there, the first 5 scrolls, are the Pentateuch, written by Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I want to stop on Deuteronomy a little bit. If you remember, if you were here last week, that in Deuteronomy, God warns in Deuteronomy 17, when you get to the land, you're going to ask for a king. And so in Deuteronomy, God says, here's what's going to happen, here's what I want you to do, right? And so really the test for Saul and the test for David and the test for Solomon and all the kings in the divided era is, are you doing what God outlined in Deuteronomy 17? Well, as it turns out, if you kind of remember the story, Deuteronomy, deutros means 2 or second, and nomos means law. It's the second giving of the law. That is, it's the second presentation of the 10 Commandments. It's the second giving of the 613 case laws. It's the second giving of the dietary laws and the laws of circumcision and the laws of the Sabbath. It's the second time giving them. They're first given in Exodus to this generation coming out of Egypt. But that generation doesn't believe God. It doesn't trust God to put them into the promised land. So if you remember, that generation wanders for 40 years. And after 40 years, all the adults of appropriate age have passed away, and that next generation is given the law a second time. That's the book of Deuteronomy. It's the re-giving of the law. It's a 40-day sermon that's done at the base of Mount Nebo, just when they're ready to cross the Jordan and actually conquer the land under Joshua. Before that happens, Moses gives it. It's kind of like Moses' last sermon. But Deuteronomy is really, really important to understand because Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law. It's given to this generation that's really becomes known as a faithful generation. It's the generation led by Joshua. And if you remember, when we read the end of Joshua and the beginning of Judges, it said that Joshua and his generation were faithful. So Deuteronomy becomes the standard by which kings are measured. It's the standard by which faithfulness is measured. And so a careful reading of Joshua shows when Joshua and the people are being obedient to what was asked of them in Deuteronomy and when they're being disobedient. And primarily Joshua and his generation are obedient. That is, Joshua is, if you can say it this way, a good book, a positive book, mostly of faithfulness. They do sin in there, but they're, primarily faithful. Judges comes along, and then the question is, will the people act in obedience to the book of Deuteronomy? They've been given what they are called to do. Will they obey? And of course, the book of Judges is no, it's terrible. It's this downward spiral of sin. And so when we say they're sinning, what are they sinning against? They're doing exactly what Deuteronomy said don't do. Okay, so Deuteronomy is the standard for Joshua, and Deuteronomy is the standard for Judges. And then when we get to Ruth, Deuteronomy is the standard, which is really interesting because Ruth is the story of a foreigner. And a foreigner has an interesting role in the Deuteronomy law, because a foreigner, if they're going to be faithful, gets welcomed in. And that's precisely what happens to Ruth. Ruth is faithful even when Naomi is wavering. Naomi comes to be faithful, but Ruth is faithful, and Mr. So-and-so is not faithful. We don't even get his name, but Boaz is faithful, and then Boaz marries Ruth, and as it turns out, then Ruth's name is preserved and becomes great. That is, God is in the business of making names great, and Ruth's name gets made great because she becomes the grandmother of King David. If I said that right, grandmother? Great-grandmother, thank you. The great-grandmother of King David, right? And of course, David's line is important now because we've read the Davidic covenant, that's the line that's going to be on the throne forever. And of course, as it turns out, Jesus is of the line of David. So when you get to Matthew chapter 1 and you read the genealogy, who appears? Ruth, the Moabitess, because she was faithful. And so Ruth, the standard of what goes on in Ruth, the standard is found in the book of Deuteronomy, okay? And so we've done Joshua, and we've done Judges, and then we've done Ruth, and then we get the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And Samuel is this warning, remember we've already done it, where when you get to the land, you're eventually going to ask for a king. Well, where's that recorded? It's in the book of Deuteronomy. And so Saul is going to get held up to the Deuteronomic, I'm making that up, the standard, right? The standard set out in the book of Deuteronomy, and Saul will fall short. And then David will be held to that standard. And David will pass the standard for a good period of time, and then he too will fall short. And then Solomon will ultimately come along. Solomon's going to come along in First and 2nd Kings. So here's the point. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, all of them are asking the same question. How are we doing with what God has called us to do? Okay? So when we get into the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, which we're going to do right now, the question is, how are the kings doing in light of what God called in the book of Deuteronomy? Does that make sense? I've already told you what happens, and I did this for a reason. 722, we leave the northern tribes to Syria. They get assimilated. Assyria works to spread them all out so that they get assimilated into and intermarry with other people and so on and so forth. In 586, Babylon comes into Jerusalem for the third time, takes people captive, destroys the city, and for 70 years they're going to be in Babylon. Okay? So I want you to know that both the north and the south end up losing. It all falls apart. In Babylon, in the 7-year exile, they start to ask the question, what happened? How on God's green earth did we get here? God promised the land. You remember one of the reasons why God was giving them the land of Canaan? I want to give you houses that you didn't build, and cities that you didn't have to put walls around, and vineyards that you didn't have to plant. I wanted it to all be done for you. You could just move in and obey and serve me. And now they're living as foreigners and sort of enslaved in a sense in Babylon. They're not allowed to go home. How did we get there? First and Second Kings, or the book of Kings, is written in Babylon to look back at what happened. And each king is measured against the laws found in the book of Deuteronomy. How did you measure up? That's the book of First and Second Kings. And I want you to understand that, because in a little bit we're going to get to First and Second Chronicles, and that's totally different. And I know if you read your Bibles, you'll read First and Second Kings, and then you'll read First and Second Chronicles and go, man, haven't I? Like, it's just kind of repeating a lot of the stuff. In one sense, First and Second Chronicles is a little less thorough, and there's a reason for that. But First and Second Chronicles is totally different. So let's totally forget about it. Let's put ourselves in the exile. We're stuck in Babylon for 70 years. By tradition, we don't know who wrote First and Second Kings, but by Jewish tradition, early tradition, they think it was Jeremiah, the prophet, which is really, really interesting, because Jeremiah is a prophet right at 586 when the Babylonians come in and so on. So it's interesting. We don't know that for sure. But this is First and Second Kings. And so First and Second Kings is going to measure every king, north and south, against what God called kings to be and do. Primarily Deuteronomy 17, but it's really all the law in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy becomes the standard for Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay, and then it stops there. Okay? Again, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, totally different. We'll get to that in a moment. But Deuteronomy is going to be the standard here. And so this is what I want you to understand. It's written in the Babylonian exile. The tradition is that Jeremiah wrote it. We don't know that as well. But see, here's the issue. And this was Samuel's issue, and I want to make sure you understand this. The people before Samuel reject God as their king. We don't want you as king. We want an earthly king. Ultimately, we get to Saul, and then to David, then to Solomon. You understand when Saul is king that God is king, right? And Saul is not really the king, God's the king. When David's the king, God's the king. When Solomon's the king, God's the king. And when Rehoboam is king and Jeroboam is king in the north, God is still king. That is, God doesn't get off the throne and somehow isn't king. So the question becomes, how do the kings respond to the King of Kings? Because it's God who's still king. I mean, whether the people want God to be their king or not, God is the one who hangs the sun in the sky. Presumably they want that. God is the one who sends rain. Whether you worship Baal or not, it's God who sends the rain, not some local deity. And so God remains king, and so this is going to be part of sort of the warp and woof of First and Second Kings, is how do the kings do at recognizing their position? And so this is what I want you to appreciate. How would you do if you were king? Or how would I do if I was king? I just want to be honest with you that I think I'd struggle. Don't accumulate wealth. Well, Saul accumulated a little bit of wealth. David accumulated a lot of wealth. And Solomon accumulated untold wealth. Probably so would I. I mean, if I could. David, we don't actually know how many wives. There's multiple wives that we know of that David married, but there's a few passages that suggest that maybe David married even more than we're aware of. So we don't really know the number. I'll throw to number 10. I'll go plus or minus 5. I have no idea. Don't put your money down on that. I'm just going to give you a number. So let's say David's 10-ish with wives. And then there's Solomon. Don't accumulate wives, and Solomon goes crazy. Don't accumulate horses. You can read in 1 Kings about the horses that Solomon accumulates. And then, of course, Deuteronomy 17 said, make sure you write a copy of God's law. I don't recall the passage where Saul does that. I can't think off the top of my head where David does that. Don't remember Solomon doing that. Right? The problem is, if you're king, you kind of think you're a king. Like, that's kind of how you think. You think paganly, which was the warning. Don't let the kings of Israel be like the pagan kings. So there's a hierarchy that 1st and 2nd Kings is going to explain. Okay? At the top is God. God is king. Okay? The kings don't like that, though. I mean, think of Ahab and Jezebel. Did he see God at the top? No, he saw himself at the top, right? But God's at the top. Under God is not the king. Under God is the messenger for the king. When God wants to speak to the king, he raises up a prophet. So above the king is the prophet. David can do whatever he wants. He sees Bathsheba and says, "Get her for me." And God sends Nathan. Nathan was above David. David thought he was above Nathan. The kings never get to take this class because they never understand this. What I'm explaining to you, every king in Israel, north and south, would disagree with. No, I'm the king. No, in God's economy, at best, you're third. At best. God, prophet, the king does the will of God by obeying the prophet. Okay? That's the hierarchy. They don't believe that. They think they're on top. I like thinking of European history because sometimes if we think about it that way, it helps us to think a little differently. So in 800 AD, so this is roughly 800 years after the birth of Christ, 800 AD, we have the rise of what becomes known as the Holy Roman Empire. And I always like to think about it this way because it wasn't holy. I mean, if you read anything about it, it's not holy. It actually isn't Roman, and it isn't an empire. It isn't any of those things. But anyway, the Holy Roman Empire begins Christmas Day, December 25th, by someone who's known as Charlemagne. He's French, and so it sounds very official. He's known in English as Charles V. So Charlemagne, or Charles V, is going to become this new emperor of this new entity that's going to come to be known as the Holy Roman Empire. And he's going to be the Holy Roman Emperor. And so Coronation Day for the Holy Roman Emperor, for Charlemagne, or Charles V, however you want to remember him, comes. And so the question is, who puts the crown on Charlemagne's head? Well, who's above the king? Well, it's the Pope. If you know anything about the Holy Roman Empire, it's a battle between the papacy, the religious rulers, and the kings, the emperors, the secular rulers. So it's Leo III. And so as Charlemagne is down kneeling to receive the crown that Leo III is the Pope, okay? Leo III is about to place the crown on Charlemagne's head, and Charlemagne reaches up, grabs the crown, and puts it on his own head. You see what he did? It's not about, I wanted to crown myself. It's about, you're not over me, Leo. I'm the Holy Roman Emperor. That's how it started. December 25th, 800. It was a battle between the religious rulers and the papacy and ultimately the secular rulers. And it goes through Charlemagne, it goes back and forth, and it's a very sordid history. And if we associate any of that with Christianity, it's shameful. It's so sad that so much of what was done under the name of Christianity. See, the problem with the kings is they kept thinking they were the top of the pyramid, and in God's economy, they never were. At best, they were number 3. But they were never even to be lord over their other people. That is, they were to see themselves as equal with every other Israelite. Well, again, if you make me king, I'm not sure. I kind of might think I'm kingish, right? I mean, can you see that? We might be susceptible to that too. If we get all the power and we have all the prestige, the only thing we really know about kings and kingship is what the secular world offers, and that's exactly what happens when we get to 1st and 2nd Kings. So 1st and 2nd Kings is going to evaluate, does the king understand who's the king? Okay, so God is king. Does the king understand this? And for the most part, all you is king does evil in the eyes of the Lord. Right? It's the Lord's evaluation. It's not Jeremiah's evaluation, if he in fact is the writer. It's the Lord's evaluation. So each king is evaluated in the eyes of the Lord, and it's all very clear. This person did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Or this person did what was even worse than his father in the eyes of the Lord. So everything is about the eyes of the Lord and how he measures these kings. I want you to see the measurement, and so now you can appreciate, to understand 1st and 2nd Kings, I'd like us to go to Deuteronomy chapter 12, because here's what's going to get measured. Deuteronomy chapter 12 will help us understand 1st and 2nd Kings. Deuteronomy chapter 12. All right. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 1. So remember, Deuteronomy is historically much, much earlier than 1st and 2nd Kings, right? After Deuteronomy is the conquest, that's Joshua, the period of the Judges, right? And then the life of Samuel, which is sort of this bridge between Judges and Kings, and then is Saul and David and Solomon, and then is the divided kingdom, which 1st and 2nd Kings is about, but it doesn't get written till after they're in exile, after 586 BC. So there's a long amount of history between 1st and 2nd Kings and Deuteronomy, but here's the standard. Chapter 12, verse 1. These are the decrees and laws that you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess. Number 1, the land is from God to you. You didn't earn it, he's giving it to you. As long as you live in the land, verse 2, destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, and every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols from the gods and wipe out their names from these places. Okay, so number 1, when you read 1st and 2nd Kings, the question is, what did the king do to the high places? Does that make sense? A high place, in the ancient way of thinking, the higher the elevation, the closer to deity. Deities are up. You want to build a temple of worship on a high place, on a hill. Okay, so if I can somehow distort all of this to make it about Stonebriar, right, as far as I can tell, everything around here is flat. So the better way to build the sanctuary here would have to see if we can maybe raise it up 4 to 6 feet with dirt and kind of build it higher and maybe make more pointy stuff up there, right? Make a higher thing, get us closer to God. That's their way of thinking. It's not our way of thinking. But what I want you to understand is this is what the kings were called to do. And so 1st and 2nd Kings is the guy did it or he didn't. Does that make sense? This is the standard, and I just want you to see it. Verse 4, you must not worship the Lord your God in their way, okay? Not the Canaanite way, not the way that the Asherah, the god Asherah was worshipped or the god Baal was worshipped, right? You think of Ahab and Jezebel. What do they set up? Baal worship. How do they do it? Exactly how Baal does it, right? Eventually, you're going to end up with a face-off between the worshipers of Baal and Elijah on top of Mount Carmel, right? And then let's figure out who's the God here. Someone send fire, and whoever sends fire will know they're the real God. Remember that showdown? That's the issue going on here. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way. You are to seek the place the Lord your God will choose. We're in Deuteronomy. David has not conquered Jerusalem. It wouldn't even make sense to suggest it's Jerusalem yet, because Jerusalem, they're not even in the land. The Lord your God will choose among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. So do you see that in Deuteronomy chapter 12, you're not allowed to make your own houses of worship wherever you want them? Nothing in Dan, nothing in Bethel, because it's with David that he promises that Solomon can build him the house, and when Solomon builds the house and the temple is opened, God says, this is where I'm putting my name. This is where I'm putting my name is a fulfillment of Deuteronomy chapter 12. To put that to that place you must go. There bring the burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and your special gifts, and what you have vowed to give, and your free will dwellings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. There in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your family shall eat, and you shall rejoice in everything you have put your hand to do, because the Lord your God has blessed you. How did the kings respond to God's blessing? Most mocked it. That's the story of 1st and 2nd Kings. That's why the whole book is more or less a train wreck. However, I'm going to be selective here, so I want to show you as the north is starting to fear being conquered by Assyria, which will happen in 722. As that's happening, I just want to give you a glimpse of the Lord as his people are unfaithful. 2 Kings 13, verse 23. But the Lord was gracious to them, and he had compassion, and he showed concern for them because of his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. This is what God's saying to the faithlessness of the northern people who never had a godly king and never worshiped him down in Jerusalem as they were commanded. It's compassionate, concern, because of the covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. To this day, he has been unwilling to destroy them or banish them from his presence. It's this spiral. You think Judges was bad? Read 1st and 2nd Kings, right? It's just worse. Like it's even worse. It's now the leaders are leading people astray in a way that was beyond what happened in the Judges. From 1 Kings 12 to 2 Kings 17, we see a ray of hope. We have the introduction of the prophet. I've already mentioned a little bit about prophets, and we'll talk about prophets when we come back from spring break. But again, a prophet is someone who speaks for God. So as people are spiraling downhill, God raises up the first model prophet, and that model is Elijah. We don't call him a writing prophet. That is, we have no book of Elijah, right? We don't say, well, turn to Elijah chapter 6. There's no such thing. We just get his life. He's not a writing prophet. But Elijah speaks the word of God, and some are transformed. And I say some because one of the things that gets introduced when prophets are introduced into 1st and 2nd Kings is the concept of a remnant. All are unfaithful, Elijah says. There's no one left but me. And God says that's not true. There's some. You're not the only one. There's 500. You're not on your own. There's a remnant. And so in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, written during the 70-year exile, looking back at the train wreck of the divided kingdom, north and south, and evaluating how the kings in the north and how the kings in the south, how they understood their role under God Almighty, which obviously was very poor. They kept thinking they were almighty. In that, God raises up prophets, and there are some who are faithful. That's where the concept begins, a remnant. Think of how that comes to the New Testament. Remember Jesus' big sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7? He ends that sermon, many will come on that day and say, Lord, did we not cast out demons and heal the sick and raise the dead? And he will say, depart from me, I never knew who you were. That is, Jesus will begin a ministry talking about wide road and narrow road. Wide, that's common, that's where most people are, leads to destruction. But narrow is the way. Some are on it. That begins with the rise of the prophet. The prophet was there to keep the king in line. Kings never listened. As a matter of fact, prophets turned from prophesying to the king to just talking to the people. The king doesn't listen anyway. And it's okay, by Jeremiah, they're not listening to the prophet either. And so God speaks, and no one listens. But don't miss this. But the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion and showed concern for them. I would have killed them in a heartbeat. Right? We're seeing compassion and graciousness that clearly wasn't deserved, and that's all I want you to see. Let's end with how 2 Kings ends. Turns to 2 Kings 25. Let's just sort of see how it ends. It's the last chapter, 2 Kings 25. This is what it's sort of concluding. Verse 8, on the 7th day of the 5th month in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard of the office of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and to all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. That is, in Jerusalem, every building got burned. This is 586 BC. Babylon's in Jerusalem, and they're destroying the whole thing. The whole Babylonian army under the commander of the imperial guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Later, Nehemiah will come back and rebuild those walls. That's when the walls get broken. The commander of the guard carried into exile the people who remained in the city along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people in the land to work the vineyards and the fields. The Babylonians broke up the bronze pillars and removed stands of the bronze sea that were in the temple of the Lord, and they carried the bronze to Babylon. They took away the pots and the shovels and the wick trimmers and the dishes and all the bronze articles used in the temple service. And the commander of the imperial guard took away the censers and the sprinkling bowls and all that were made of pure gold or silver. And it goes on and on and on. Look at the end of verse 21. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. Verse 26, at this all the people from the least to the greatest, together with army officers, fled to Egypt for fear of the Babylonians. That's the few who were left, organized themselves, and fled to Egypt. We're right back where we started. What did God say when they came out of Egypt? Never go back. Never return. What did the people say when they grumbled? If only we had stayed in Egypt. In Egypt, we had food. In Egypt, we had water. Everything was so good in Egypt. And by the end of 2 Kings, some go back. It's just a cycle. It's just the way our lives are lived. It's all the same. God is faithful. God works. Some respond. Some obey. Many don't and find themselves right back in the very thing God had delivered them from. 2 Kings ends with some folks going back to Egypt, the rest going into captivity into Babylon, where they'll be for 70 years. God is gracious. God is faithful. We learn about our God through reading these stories that he has given us. He tends not to give us his resume. He gives us his work experience. He doesn't say, I'm gracious. He says, here's how I handled this situation, and we see God's grace. He doesn't say you're wicked and sinful. Well, he does from time to time. But he rather just shows how the people act, and we can see, and probably even see some of ourselves in there. And so the whole process of working through the story of Scripture is seeing a God who's greater than we can imagine. People who don't read the Old Testament say things like, well, in the Old Testament, God was angry, and in the New Testament, he's kind. No, there's a lot more grace in the Old Testament than there was in the New. It's a lot longer, and it's filled with God's grace. And it's interesting because you have more usage of the words grace in the Old Testament than you have in the New Testament. It's one God. It's the same God through the whole thing. But we start to see who he is, and that's the one who we believe in. Father, we're grateful for your grace. We all need it because none of us are worthy. None of us are somehow an enhancement to who you are. And so we marvel at your compassion even when your people were so wicked, as we look back to the time of the kings, both united and divided. And we, in all of that, we see some of ourselves. And so, Father, I pray that we would be people who respond to your word in obedience. We're mindful of what Samuel told Saul. It's better to obey than to sacrifice. Help us to obey and to model obedience to you. Rather than repenting for all the sins we keep committing, to obey and to not commit them. To be faithful to the one who's been faithful to us. May our time in your word remind us of you, and then help us to act accordingly. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Have a good week.